Okay, happy Hanukkah to everyone. It's the third night. Have our Chanukah relit again for the second time tonight, so everybody can see. So I guess in a way for us, it's the sixth night. And the parsha this week is Parshat Miketz. And we're going to take an insight into parsha. The title of this class is Spotlighting. And I just remember once upon a time being at a performance and they kept putting the spotlight on the wrong performer. And after a little while, the performers on the stage were going crazy to the extent that they actually stopped what they were doing. And one of them ran up all the way through to the upstairs to speak to the spotlight guy and get him refocused. So I think that's a good analogy for what we have to do ourselves sometimes, and especially with Hanukkah, because Hanukkah, we light the menorah to add a special illumination to the world. And we're going to see how that plays out in terms of this week's Torah reading. The parsha this week of Miketz, it begins very famously with Yosef languishing in jail. And if you think about it, he's had a tremendous roller coaster ride already, sold out by his brothers, rises to a position of prominence within the household of one of the ministers of Paro, ends up thrown into prison, rises once again, interprets some dreams that correctly, and then finds himself all of a sudden um, rescued. Rescued, surprisingly, after 2 years, two uneventful additional years, 12 years in total, where he's been away from his family. 12 years in which his father, Yaakov, has been bereft and in mourning, assuming that he was lost forever. And all these years where the brothers have apparently been living with the perspective that their selling out of their brother was okay. It was called for, it was justified. And time where Yosef himself must be in a position of remembering those two dreams that he shared in his youth and having clinging to some kind of hope that things would come out in a good way. So what happens tumultuously, and you can only imagine what it's like to be in one fell swoop, dragged out of prison, cleaned up, as the Torah says, brought before Paro, the most powerful man on earth at the time, in terms of politically and socially and economically, and asked to interpret dreams. And he does so correctly. And Paro was very captured by Yosef, and we've discussed a few years ago how Yosef himself stays so true to his background. Because when Paro says, I hear you interpret dreams, he doesn't say, yeah, I'm good at interpreting dreams. What Yosef says is, Hashem clarifies my vision and enables me or places within me a certain wisdom. So he's very clear, very humble. In any event, Paro basically goes bananas and he says, have you ever seen a person like this? And that's where we're going to pick up the narrative. It's in chapter 41, basically sentence 41, where Paro says, I'm going to place you in charge of everything. First, he says in sentence 38, could we find another like him, a man in whom is the spirit of Hashem, mentioning God's name, using the name Elohim? You shall be in charge of my palace, and by your command shall all the people be sustained. Only by the throne shall I outrank you. And then this is what we're going to pick up on sentence 41. Paro turns to Yosef and says directly to him, Re'eh, see, Natati otcha al kol eretz Mitzrayim. I have placed you above, upon, in charge of the land of Mitzrayim. Now, understand what this means. I mean, because right now there's a worldwide famine going on. They're the only ones, they have all the food. They have all the sustenance for the whole world, something which Yosef was very tuned into, because Yosef says later at the end of Bereshit that he understood right away that his goal, his purpose in life was to feed and sustain the children of Yaakov. So Yosef, if you just have to understand his dreams which included the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him, didn't go to his head and put him in the position of feeling as though, wow, now I see these dreams are coming true, and now I can lord it over everyone, and I can take revenge, and I can clear up all these past wrongs that have happened to me. That's not what's in Yosef's mind. But Yosef, as he says later on in the Torah, is very clear that there's a purpose, and we're going to talk about that, seeing one's purpose in life. And Yosef is crystal clear. The spotlight is on the right emphasis in his life, that God has placed him in this position. And yet Paro takes the time to turn to him and says, see. Now, it's a little ridiculous for Paro to say that, because Paro just dragged him out of a dungeon. They had to cut his hair. They had to bathe him. Dungeons are not very pleasant places. I visited the Tower of London once upon a time. I remember looking down into a dungeon. They don't even let you into them, but I mean, they're basically rat-infested holes in the ground where people just languished, and occasionally they throw a few bites of food down there, I guess, and it was a choice whether the rats would eat it before the people or the people before them. But so Yosef is all of a sudden in this position, and yet Paro is concerned that his vision will not be clear. And he says, hey, look and see, you're in charge of everything. You have a responsibility. It's important for you, as we use the word re'eh, to be contemplative and to be self-aware and to be understanding. All that's included in the word re'eh. And that's what the Seforno, the classical commentary on the Torah, points out. And the Rosh Hashiva of Chavetz Chaim basically points this out in a very interesting way and says, my goodness, of all the people in the world, nobody could ever be more attuned to the position that they are suddenly being placed in than Yosef, coming out of the dungeon moments before. And yet Paro, and by the way, we deem Paro to be a master of understanding of people. Just parenthetically, the Mesilat Yesharim, when he looks at the idea of people not becoming too absorbed in their work, points to the section of Exodus where Paro says, Tichbar aleim ha'avoda, because Paro understood that if you want to morally demoralize a people, if you load them up with a tremendous absorption in their physical work and in making their way in the world, they will forget all about spirituality. They'll forget about their humanity. They will lose everything, which is something, unfortunately, any account of the Holocaust also makes that clear, how debilitating that was to the Jewish people. So here, Paro is using this tremendous insight, and he's teaching us a lesson in the way he talks to Yosef. And especially at the time of Chanukah, and this is what we're going to talk about a little bit more, the idea of seeing, what a person sees. And I begin by saying that the famous philosophical comment that we have is a legacy from the Greeks. And I forget the name of the person now. He was sort of the father of cynicism, but it's one of the revered Greek philosophers walking around in the daytime with a lamp lit. And everybody asking him, what are you doing? It's daytime. Why do you have your lamp lit? And he famously answered, I am looking for an honest person. Okay? So that also reflects the idea that being able to perceive correctly is not something that's very, very, very simple or should be taken for granted. We see this also, and I just want to drive the point home. When we, the Jewish people, stood at Har Sinai, that's deemed by the rabbis to be the most dramatic moment in world history. Like the whole world was aware that God's presence entered the world, was standing on Har Sinai, and that the Torah was being given. That's the way it's described. We do in Hallel, it's referred to a few times, that the world came literally to a standstill at that moment. And yet, as soon as the experience of Sinai was over, God goes out of his way to tell Moshe, to tell the people, remember what you have seen here. It's in Shemot, chapter 20, 19, Atem ra'item ki mina shamayim dibarti imochem. Behold, you saw God speak to you. Now, again, it's a funny moment. How many times have you heard or I heard someone who doesn't want to believe or isn't accepting of the divinity of the Torah say, well, if God were to speak to me and tell me or appear to me and tell me that this is the truth and this is what he wants me to do, for sure I would do it. But it's a long time ago, and God can't expect us to be. So what you see here is an amazing thing. Even within minutes of God actually speaking to the Jewish people, God tells Moshe to remind the people, remember what you have just seen. So that skeptic today, all these 3,300 and some years after Mount Sinai, who says, well, if God would appear to me, I would believe, God had that concern with the very people who were there at Har Sinai. So we see something about human nature, which the Mesilat Yesharim emphasizes over and over again, and that is that the essence of life, the spirituality of life, people tend to push it aside. We're physical beings. We default to see the world in very physical terms, very much in terms of eating, drinking, sleeping, satisfying our basic needs, and it's a stretch. It requires effort on our part to see beyond that. So I just want to describe the situation because this week's Torah reading ends with the brothers having stood before Yosef, not recognized him retaining Shimon in prison, putting the money back in the sack of Levi. By the way, those are the two brothers who, by tradition, instigated the sale of Yosef. The brothers are becoming increasingly apprehensive and aware that events are unfolding in a way which would indicate the fact that what they did was wrong. We hear little tidbits of that. But in the end of the Parsha, the brothers are dragged back to Egypt as criminals and ready to face Yosef, and Yosef is in the. So we just have to see what the perspective is. In terms of purpose in life, in other words, Yaakov, the father, remains in the land of Canaan, convinced that the whole prophetic vision of him raising 12 tribes of the Jewish people is lost forever. And he's living with that sense of despair. And I use the word despair lightly because we're talking about Yaakov Avinu, but that sense of loss. The brothers are in a rather uncomfortable position at the end of the Parsha, but they're really just beginning to gain awareness that these events that are unfolding are, and they still don't recognize their brother Yosef as Yosef. So they haven't really, as we said last week, connected that many dots. But at least they're becoming increasingly aware that God is orchestrating events in a manner which have a goal and a purpose to redress and correct what was done to Yosef. And Yosef himself is in the position of seeing step by step those two dreams that he dreamt becoming fulfilled. So it's a very, very big gaps in perspective in terms of where everyone's at the end of this week's Parsha. The comment this leads me to understand about Chanukah is as follows. I mentioned the idea that the Greeks are extremely visual people. They had this idea that form shows purpose. They drew objects. They had tremendous regard for art, for reproducing human forms. They invented all kinds of representations of the world. All the arts really come from them. But they did so in a manner which belies the fact that there's anything unique or extraordinary about humanity in terms of spiritual beings. That's clear. And that becomes the conflict between the Jewish people and the Greeks at the time of Hanukkah. We have to remember, and Hirsch in Choreh puts it very beautifully, that for the first time in history, a nation rose up against us with no interest in harming us. There was no sense of eliminating us from the world. There was no sense of eliminating us even from the land of Israel, to put it in very contemporary terms. What did they want? They simply wanted us to become a nation amongst the nations like everybody else. And that's, without going into a lot of details, that's the idea that Timu Kol Hashmanim, they defiled the oil. Now, it's a wild thing, because why didn't they ruin the menorah? Why didn't they melt it down? Why didn't they spill out all the oil? They simply went around the Beit HaMikdash and they made the oil ritually defiled. So in other words, go ahead, light your menorah every day. And we would assume that the Hellenized Jews who were running the Beit HaMikdash under the Greek rule, they continued to do that every day. And they didn't care that the oil wasn't sanctified, it wasn't tahor, it wasn't pure, it had been ritually contaminated, it was not fit for use, because that was the whole goal of the Greeks. You're a nation like any other nation. Now, what does it mean to become a nation like any other nation? It puts us in the position of the guy whose name you probably have there, but the Greek philosopher who takes his lantern to heighten his personal sense of vision and goes out in the world and says, I'm looking for an honest man. What's his criteria for being an honest man? Does he have a Torah? Does he have a set of laws? Does he have a revelation? Does he have a God that defines it? No. He does what we live in a world today that's very much like that. Whatever he feels, whatever he sees, whatever he independently perceives as being greatness in a person, that's greatness. I'm the judge, like they used to say in the Old Western, I'm the judge, jury, and executioner. So the Greeks stood for an idea that their personal vision, what they see, is the ultimate. There's nothing more than what they see. What they saw, they felt is what we got, what we get, whatever the correct English is. And there's nothing more to life than that. And they lived accordingly. And for an amazing reason, they couldn't stand the idea that the Jewish people who willingly had become part of the Greek Empire, who quote unquote surrendered to Alexander the Great when he came to Jerusalem, and in tribute and honor named every boy born that year Alexander. We use that name yet today. So in other words, we had no problem becoming absorbed into the politics, and we could do so safely, physically safely. But all of a sudden what turned is, but if you're going to keep Shabbos, if you're going to persist, and this I think is what I want to emphasize, in not relying on your own vision, but rather relying on these antiquated ideas that you get from the Torah. That's basically what they were saying to us. And that you have a fixed sense of morality and you don't trust your eyes to decide, but and what I would say is you hear. So I want to just make a distinction between seeing and hearing. What I see, and I can interpret it any way. And if I'm delusional, I can see anything that my mind tells me I'm seeing. Hearing automatically involves another human being. It involves two perspectives. So in other words, like I described before, Yaakov was in one position, the brothers were in another position, Yosef was in another position. If they had a conversation, which they do end up having, it resolves things in a correct manner. But so therefore, when we say Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, what we're really saying each and every day is that we're relying on our hearing, on our received knowledge, ultimately on the revelation at Sinai that God reminds us of what we saw and what we heard, and that God spoke to us. Okay, these are really big ideas, because if God speaks to me, again, I can still lose my way. Moshe was still instructed to remind the people what they had seen. There's plenty of room for me to have freedom of choice to be a more moral, less moral person, but at least it came from outside of me, and I have to reconcile it with what I heard from the outside. Unlike the sense of the Greeks, which is that each individual person can perceive reality the way they want, and hence we live in a world today in which there's no fixed sense of what's right and wrong. And we can, as societies, we can respect people who celebrate events like the ones that took place on October 7th, or events like that took place a couple of days ago in Sydney, Australia, and celebrate them with logic and viewpoint, and what they saw happening, they think is justice, and they think is right, and they think upholds truth. That's the world we live in today. So we see from a Greek perspective, from a Hanukkah perspective, that's what they see. And when you try talking to these people, it's very hard to do so because they see what they see, and they don't feel subject to any review or any standard that's going to at all interfere with the conclusions that they choose to draw from what they see. And what do we say in the Torah, in the very Shema, which emphasizes hearing? We say, "V'lo tatur acharei levavchem v'acharei einechem." Don't get lost after the yearnings of your heart and after what your eyes see, acharei einechem, what your eyes see. So you can see how it's really played out in the Torah in a very significant way. The sense that in other words, when someone stops you, like Paro stopping Yosef, say, okay, you're excited, you see a lot of great things happening. I want you to think about it. I want you to consider it. I'm telling you that I have a perspective that matters also. But that's not on a God religious level, but at least that's on a level that it's not all just up to you charging ahead with your own feelings and your own perspective and feeling as though that represents the ultimate sense of truth and the ultimate sense of reality. You see the same thing when and I want to refer to this in the after the splitting of the sea, when the Jewish people see the Egyptians totally vanquished. So it says there, "Vayaminu b'Hashem of Moshe Abdo." They acquired a certain level of faith and emuna in God, okay, which is the ultimate sense of something coming from outside of yourself, okay, because we know in a practical sense, for good and for bad. When God acts in a certain way, it's not for us to reason why, it's but for us to do and die, as the poet once upon a time wrote. In other words, we understand that God's perspective far supersedes our own. And therefore, when God shows us something and speaks to us about something, and how do we refer to Hashem there in the song? Ish milchama. Hashem is a man of war. Meaning what? Meaning that there's a morality to every act that God does. And I want to just pull back from the intensity of this for a second and say that, first of all, I'll tell you that tonight's the third night of Hanukkah. So we see the Chanukah burning over here. There's an interesting, I think it's Hasidic basis, but every day in the davening, when right in the second bracha before the Shema, we refer to Hashem as Poel Gevurot, that God does wonders. Oseh Chadoshos, he makes new things. Baal Milchamos, the third is God is the master of war, and that tonight being the third night. And I just want to add that we have a responsibility to see the miraculousness of what has taken place in these last 2 years, from the sense of how God has fought wars on our behalf. Now, we've sustained tremendous losses, and we know through Jewish history that's often the case, and I'm not belittling those losses whatsoever, but we would be very remiss if we didn't hear in our own ears this description of God as being a Baal Milchomos, or Ish Hashem Ish Milchomos, as it says after the splitting of the sea. I remember distinctly a few days after October 7th, hearing a person, a political analyst, saying that the war hasn't even begun yet. I thought, like, how could he dare say that? Is he, dishonoring the loss of the 1,200 people, the captives? I mean, it was a very raw moment. And he basically said, you ain't seen nothing yet, because he said, you've got Hezbollah, you've got Israel surrounded on all sides, you've got the perfect setup now for Iran to basically eliminate Israel, having dispirited Israel with this brutal attack and having panicked the country. And honestly, nobody expecting the vigor and the strength and the bravery of a young generation of people between the ages of 20 and 40, who everybody assumed were soft and didn't have the backbone and didn't have the drive to really defend something, as we really assume much of the world is in that position today. You know, when Europe talks about preparing for war, as they're talking about now for the first time, you look around and say, well, who do they think is going to fight that war? And, you know, honestly, in 1940, they didn't have too many people ready to fight that war either. But this is where we're at. So when we see things, we have to try to listen as Jews, and we have to push aside the amazing influence of Greek culture has had in eroding our clarity of what we have heard God say to us, what we have heard our ancestors, the Jewish people, say about God at the splitting of the sea. And we have to utilize this instruction that Paro gives to Yosef and that God tells Moshe to give to the Jewish people moments after the revelation at Sinai, and tell ourselves, no matter how dramatic these events may appear to us, we need to contemplate them. We need to not just interpret them with our eyes, but we need to put them in the context of what we have heard as Jewish people. And that's where we're at today. In other words, this Parsha falling as it does, and us learning on the third night of Hanukkah, where on my mind, this idea of Baal Milchamos comes to the fore. Yeah, I will tell you, a couple of years ago, I had some pretty hefty surgery on the sixth night of Hanukkah, and I felt very comforted by the fact that the sixth is Borei Refuot, that God is responsible and creates healing in the world. So as we go through these 8 nights of Hanukkah and we look for inspiration and we look to motivate ourselves and we look to really capture the light of the menorah in its uniqueness, in its purity, and the fact that it's not just beautiful to look at. Greeks did a lot of looking at beautiful things. They were able to capture beauty like nobody else in the world ever could before. But we need to capture something else. We need to capture the resolve and the sense that we are going to follow our ears before our eyes and before our hearts, just as we say in the Shema. And we're going to emphasize to ourselves that as life unfolds, and please God, it should unfold only in a good way, we stay tuned in to and keep the spotlight on what we know from Jewish tradition is going to see us through and is going to enable us not just to prevail or survive, but enable us to actually capture that purity and holiness that the Beit HaMikdash represented. Because after all, this whole triumph was simply relighting the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. Of the Maccabee brothers, all but one die in the fighting. I think most of them died after the miracle of Hanukkah because the fighting persisted. It wasn't any kind of a decisive victory, you know. And we know as we look at the story of Yosef and his brothers, at the end of the day, we end up in Golut in Mitzrayim in Egypt. And as we turn into the next book of the Torah, we're going to see tremendous enslavement and suffering and privation that goes on for 210 years, according to our account. So it's not, you know, it's a question of striving to really make the most of all the opportunities that our Torah gives us to do and to live our lives in this way as individuals, as families, as communities, and as the Jewish people. And please God, we should continue to do so. Anybody have a question or a comment? I'm happy to address it if I